Hello, everyone. Welcome to the inaugural event of the 2020 Norfolk Chamber Music Festival. This year, as you know, it's going to be a virtual festival. I'm sorry we can't see all of you in person, but we're happy to bring you a few events that hopefully will give you the taste of what Norfolk would be like in a normal summer. I'm here at Norfolk. I have with me Paul Berry, who you may know from pre-concert lectures there, and he's also a professor of music history at the Yale School of Music. We're beginning our season with a two-part series of conversations about the origins of chamber music. What is chamber music? Next week, at the same time, same day, we'll also be talking with Paul about the significance of chamber music, the relevance of chamber music, why everyone in the world should be listening to chamber music. So I hope you can join us for that. And that's a preview for our four-concert virtual concert series beginning on July 2nd with a concert by the Brentano Quartet. So I hope you can join us for that. So thank you for being with us, and thank you, Paul, for joining me for this conversation. I think the simplest question I want to pose to you, Paul, in the form of a verbal question, and then I want to show a video, is what is chamber music? Like, what does it mean? Like, what kind of music are we talking about? Some people think of it as music for, a small group of people. Some people think of it as music in a chamber. What is that? To kind of spur the discussion, I'd like to start by showing a video of little excerpts of music that we have presented here at the Norfolk Chamber Music Festival, and then we'll talk about it. So let me show this video, and I hope the technology works. Oh, wait a minute. Okay.
I have said those words about 50 times over the past 6 weeks.
Okay, here we go.
And dusty road tramps a soldier with his load.
Okay, so before I continue with my question, I want to say that to all of you watching, I hope that if you have questions, please, during anything we talk about, please type them in the chat or email us, And we've left some time at the end to answer questions. So please, if you have any questions, don't be afraid to type them into the chat. So Paul, we saw quite a variety of stuff there. What is chamber music exactly?
Yeah, somebody should type that question in, and then we'll just, we'll have the talk. I just want to say it's really good, even vicariously, to imagine myself seeing all of you, right? I mean, old friends, faces that I would recognize if I could see through your screen as you're seeing into mine, and also new friends, folks I haven't met. It's really, really great. Right, what is chamber music? I was trying to think about this. I knew the question was coming. I love the videos, and I love the variety of those, right? I mean, there were, some of those had almost 35, 40 people on stage. Some of them had 2 people on stage, right? It was a huge variety of things, playing all sorts of instruments, singing. Right. I thought about this a bit, and I think what I would want to urge us to think about is sort of, there's a spectrum of definitions of chamber music, right? There's not just one. And on the one end of the spectrum right now in the kind of COVID-19 universe, I think we could say there's an epidemiological definition of chamber music. And on the other end, there's a sort of sociological one. So the epidemiological definition would be the simplest. And that would be, people in a room making music with and for each other. People in a room making music with and for each other. But chamber means room, therefore chamber music would be music in a room that people are making. And that sort of thing has been around for as long as we know that there has been music of any kind, and really for as long as we know that there have been humans. And rooms, right? Then there's, on the other side of the spectrum, you might say, the sort of sociological definition, which would be a much more specific thing. I had to write it down. I was trying to think of all the different ingredients that go into this. So I'm gonna, if you pardon me, I'm gonna read this because I want to get them all. Because the more precise you want to be about this, the more that the practitioners of chamber music might want to argue with you about it, in the way that practitioners of jazz, when you say, what is jazz, will suddenly get into arguments. I think practitioners of chamber music might do the same thing. So here's a really rigorous sociological definition. Ready? People sitting still in a darkened room, paying money to listen quietly to a small number of instruments, probably including violins, whose players are using printed scores to play music by dead people that takes years and years to master in a legal sense, and possibly in an academic context. That's a really long definition, but I think it's very specific, Paul. It's super specific, right? But what I'm trying to give is a sense of the spectrum of this, right? Because on the one hand, chamber music seems like a very flexible concept that could cover pretty much most music made by most people at most times, right? And then on the more specific side of it, you have the thing that you pay to listen to in certain performance venues, right? And that comes with these assumptions, right? That you're going to sit still. It's going to be you're going to probably have to pay some money to listen to it. There's going to be a small number of instruments. It doesn't involve voices. I hope people were struck by the number of singing voices in these excerpts. It's actually not always typical of chamber music festivals or concert series. Usually they don't involve singers, right? So number of instruments, scores to play old music, right? I mean, always it's not music by a person who's alive. And also almost all music that in this particular kind of context that we're talking about, music that is technically extremely challenging for the players. So all of those kind of additional elements are things that have accreted to a basic kind of epidemiological definition of chamber music over time. That is, they are practices that have come to hold sway in the particular context that Norfolk and the Chamber Music Festival at Norfolk finds itself a part of. That's too long an answer, Melvin, sorry.
No. So let me ask you a question. Is, as you said, people have been making music in small groups since the beginning of time, right? Like when would you consider, in your own definition of chamber music, like when does that start? Are we talking about the Baroque period, the classical period? Like what kind of vague time frame?
Right, so different elements of this definition that I gave came at different points, right? And I think, it's linked to various different events in not just the history of music, but the history of sort of human society and technology, right? The bit about playing music from printed scores, or now, an iPad that you can touch to turn the pages, but which is nevertheless showing you printed music, right? That couldn't happen without the invention of musical notation, which happened around the year 800, give or take, in the West. And also couldn't have happened without instrumentalists being practitioners of musical notation. And that happened a lot later, typically, right? Musical notation was invented for the church to be used by clerics in singing. It migrated to the courts, which were tightly connected to the church, right? And used, again, sort of by off-duty clerics who were also courtiers, for the conveying of very, very kind of abstruse particular kinds of music. And I think it took a long time for instrumentalists who tended to be looked down on by literate, so-called literate musicians, that is, musicians who could read printed word, the written word, and then also the written notes. It took a long time for instrumentalists to adopt printed scores, right? And there are market forces behind that. So then you go to the invention of printing and its adoption quite early on, actually, by printers of music, around the year 1500, give or take. So at that point, you have something that actually, even that early, right, in the kind of the high Renaissance, you have something that I think I would consider to be chamber music by many, not all, not in a darkened room necessarily, but by many of the definitions we just talked about. That is, there's a marketplace for people to buy scores of music that they can then perform with and for each other. Again, this was vocal music initially, right? But it's a thriving marketplace, right? And it grows and grows over time, and then instrumentalists sort of add them to it. And then for a variety of reasons, as you get into the 18th century and beyond, instrumental music starts to sort of take over, in a sense, from vocal music as the musical art. By the end of the 19th, at least in German-speaking countries, which is where a lot of the core of the repertoire that tended to be performed in chamber music settings for 100 years originated in those settings. Instrumental music by the end of the 19th century was sort of the predominant, had the most cachet, right, for composers.
So is it
it's a labored process, right?
Right, but is it accurate to say that like chamber music grew out of a secular music tradition as opposed to a religious music tradition?
Well, that's interesting. I mean, by the broader definition that I was using back in the early Renaissance, no, right? In other words, the first printed music that you would take home and sing with your friends and sing to your friends in a chamber was actually, a lot of it was religious music, right? The first print was a collection of masses, right? For use in a non-liturgical context, right? For use in the chamber, right? And you have this throughout the 16th and into the 17th century. So like in Elizabethan England, right, where Catholicism is a no-no, and yet the rich heritage of music involves a lot of people who were practicing Catholics. These folks are circulating what I would call chamber music. That is, religious pieces specific for Catholic doctrine that are sung in the chamber, right? That can't possibly be sung in church, because you'd be in big trouble if you did it. But you can do it around the fireplace with some friends, right? So that's there. But I think that which is why I was so interested, Melvin, in your choice of some of these excerpts, right? The fact that the Brahms Requiem movement was there, the fact that Roomful of Teeth was there, right? Things that harken back to this, actually, to lots of music that's been sung in lots of chambers and performed in lots of chambers. But I would say that Norfolk is, I don't want to say unique, but it's unusual in the past few years at having this. I know there's a choral heritage at Norfolk, which is where the Brahms Requiem is coming out of. But the Roomful of Teeth, that's a sort of, these are verging, and I've seen at Norfolk over the past 3 years, people sing at the same concert at which somebody's playing a string quartet, right? And that's, I think, hearkening back to an important earlier set of definitions. But I think Norfolk's a little unusual in that regard. Usually you go to a chamber music festival and what you expect is string instruments, some pianos.
So how did that happen? What happened that the instrumental music and chamber music became predominant? And the voice, I mean, it's there in certain number of pieces, although I wouldn't say that makes up the majority of chamber music.
Certainly not from the 18th and 19th centuries. Although I would remind us that even, say during his lifetime, Schubert, the first excerpt that we heard was the very beginning of the Schubert so-called cello quintet, right? The string quintet that has two cellos in it. And that piece, one of the last pieces that he wrote, that's not the music that people knew Schubert for during his life. They knew him as a writer of dance music for piano duo that is chamber music by any definition, that could function as a kind of a dance enhancer, and songs and male voice quartets, which were chamber music. That is, you get together with your guy friends and you sing this stuff, right? So, but you're right. I mean, like the tradition that's been handed down to us out of the late 18th and 19th centuries, which is still the core of the chamber music festival that's usually conceived, that music is predominantly instrumental, right? And so how did this happen? I think part of it had to do with the expertise of, in the earlier 18th century, the in a secular context, in a court context, to have competence with a musical instrument was, considered a mark of distinction and education in a sense, right? The King of Prussia played the flute, quite well, right? And so, in that context, you can see how in the origins of the earlier 18th century, as chamber music begins, instrumental music is rising in importance. Part of that has to do with who's playing it, right? But I think again in the early 18th century, you would see chamber music, you would see instrumental music as divided into two, and it was divided according to function. So you could write a sonata. And if you wrote a sonata, it would be one of two kinds. It would be a church sonata or a chamber sonata. The church sonata would be appropriate for performance in a quasi-liturgical context in a sacred space. And the chamber sonata was defined by not being that. That is, the chamber sonata had like dance movements in it, things that would be seen as really problematic morally to put in a church. Over the 18th century, it's the chamber part that becomes so important for instrumental composition. And part of that also is just the kind of great composers, somebody like Haydn, the so-called father of the string quartet, who wrote extremely influential, great music, which began as music for amateurs to play, good amateurs, but amateurs to play with and for each other, right? Instead of binge watching Netflix, if the coronavirus had hit in 1770, you wouldn't have. What you did have is every string came in a group of 6, and so string quartets, that's a good worth of energy, particularly if you're not a great amateur. You screw up a few times and you have to go back and start over. So like that's music for amateurs. And then by the late 18th century, patronage collapses as a system of paying for music. That is, okay, there are no aristocrats left in France because they've been guillotined or they've fled. And the economic depression that the Napoleonic Wars and all sorts of things brought about led to a situation where the courts aren't paying a lot for music anymore. And so all of a sudden, this music designed for a small number of amateurs suddenly becomes available through publishing to a much wider group of people.
So I want to let's talk about that for a minute, because I think this transition is interesting to me. So in Haydn's time, if you were a typical musician, instrumentalist, how did you make your money? How did you support yourself?
Right. So that changed drastically between Haydn's birth in 1732 and his death in 1809. Right. There's a huge difference there.
Yeah.
And I think, again, if you're an instrumentalist, let's say, you're leaving out composers, Melvin, when you ask this question.
Well, no, composers too. I mean, I know that changes too, but we can talk
about the distinction between those two things is really not very strong. And when Haydn's a kid, right? I mean, Haydn's perfectly competent on string instruments and also on keyboard. Right. So I think, when he was trained as a singer in the church, as many people were, that was a great musical education for a young person. Right. But then, he needed a job he needed a patron. He needed a job either in a church or he needed somebody who could pay him, with his skills as a composer. Eventually, it took him 15 years, but he got the ideal job. That is one in which he was court orchestra that was lavishly funded, that involved, a large number of people for an orchestra at that time, right?
Right, and who
he could try positions.
Right, and what kind of audience would that music would be performed for?
So that's the thing that changes over the course of his life, right? So when he gets that court appointment, he's writing music for the prince, for Prince Esterhazy and his family, and all the people who come and visit him on his estate, and the kind of other noblemen, and et cetera, to hear, right? And his main contract calls for opera, right? And instrumental music is sort of still secondary, right? But as he becomes the most famous living composer, right, over the course of his career, he renegotiates his contract. He's a very savvy businessman. He sees that there are marketplaces opening that he doesn't have control over and that he would like to have control over. Basically, people were pirating his music and publishing it without his permission. He was making no money on it. So he renegotiated his contract with the prince even before even before the prince gave up on music, right? He renegotiated his contract so that, and this is around 1780 or so that he could publish music on his own, right? And make money off of this emerging marketplace of people who are not necessarily in a court, but who were upper middle class people with the leisure time to be able to learn how to play string instruments competently, right? Men tended to learn string instruments because it's only one melody, right? Whereas women tended to learn upper because it takes actually more time, more leisure time to learn it. I mean, the idea, right, was that string instruments are just doing, the piano is playing the whole texture. And so, but that's the marketplace that he can tap into, is these people, and it's an exponentially growing marketplace at that time. So that's part of that transition. And you can look at his contemporaries, people like Clementi, who begins in the service of an English patron, and by the end of his life owns a publishing house, a piano making firm. You know, I mean, he's an industry, right? And people who succeeded in that transition were really creative and interesting.
So what happened to the patronage system?
Well, again, after the French Revolution, and again after the kind of economic depression that set in across Europe, not just in France, it never returned to what it had been. I mean, I think the analogy, I guess, today, there's patronage in Europe, but it primarily comes from nations.
The government,
right?
Yeah.
The government, the federal government of Germany supports, right, musicians. But I think, you know, and there were individual courts that kind of came back and began to keep, the court at Mannheim was one, right, that in the 19th century had a crackerjack orchestra. But in general, it declined to the point where musicians had to find another marketplace. And what they found was middle class, first upper middle class, and then more broadly middle class people who could afford to have a piano at home, who could afford to have a string and hat and pay someone to teach them how to, and who could be entertained by this music. So that marketplace is a really important one. The funny thing is, simultaneously, another thing is happening: public concert, in which chamber music has an increasingly important role, and therefore in which professional caliber musicians are playing music which is amateurs in the concert hall becomes something more like that giant sentence that I had, where people are listening quietly, where they're extremely high level of virtuosity, right? And where they're writing for that kind of context, they can write really difficult music.
Right. I mean, I haven't done much research into it, but it from what I understand, like they were the public concert kind of arose and out of a, during like intermissions of plays and stuff. And so during that time, actually, the audience wasn't quiet,
Right.
And then, later on, I think that talking about this will be interesting too, that it evolved into something that looks more like the concert of today.
The 18th century public concert, and there were some before then even, but the 18th century public concert is primarily something that happened either in the intermissions of other things or like during Lent, right? Because that's when you weren't allowed to mount operatic productions. And opera was still queen. I mean, opera was the topical art, right? 18th and throughout most of the 19th century in most countries. And so, during a time when in a Catholic country you couldn't mount operatic productions, that's when you would have these public offerings that were, of similar size and scope. They just didn't involve staging, right? And you're right. Those were, fairly, I mean, raucous is the wrong word, but fairs that were open to probably a bigger marketplace in certain ways than, so it's one thing to have the leisure money to spend on a concert. It's another thing to have the leisure money to spend on making yourself able to play the music, right? A broader audience.
Right.
As long as there's a marketplace for it, but it does take a while for the concert to become the kind that we're now accustomed to and sometimes roll our eyes at about chamber music, where we all have to be absolutely quiet and reverential. That it takes a whole shift for that mid-19th or 19th century phenomenon rather than an 18th century phenomenon.
And during those kind of what you call raucous public concerts, there weren't whole concerts of chamber music. It was more, there would definitely be arias. There would be people playing showpieces. Then you might have a work of chamber music.
The goal of those concerts was really analogous to the goal that music has almost always had in virtually every human culture, and that is to entertain in the moment, right? And so the vast majority of those pieces were newly composed or extremely recent works, right? Now, right, for current taste, and you're exactly right. They belong to a variety of genres. So you would have the operatic soprano who's in town to sing the opera maybe, or who sang last week, but now it's Lenten, so she's not singing. So she sings an aria or something. You've got the virtuoso piano violinist, or Boccherini's in town and plays a cello, or in town and plays a violin. That's a big part of it, right? Some great virtuoso people really want to hear. You might have a symphony to kind of shut people up at the beginning, but it's probably not the centerpiece of what you're doing, nor necessarily would a piece of chamber music be, although sometimes one could be written that could really showcase an important person. So again, with the later 19th century comes that turn to playing old music, that is playing a kind of canon of established works rather than whatever's new right now. And also a sense that genre mattered and that you should divide the genres from each other and keep the chamber music in its own kind of arena where you can really listen to it in a very intimate way.
So, I mean, there are so many questions I want to ask you about this. I think if we turn to Haydn, for example, like he's, as you said, considered the father of the string quartet. Was the primary reason he started writing string quartets was it for amateurs to play, or was there something that he found attractive about the string quartet? You know what I mean? Like,
so that's a profound kind of question, right? I mean, certainly it was attractive for amateurs to play. And if you look at the early Haydn quartets, Opus 1 and Opus 2, and Opus 9, Opus 17, it's not that these pieces have no musical interest, far from it, right? But they are technically playable by most people who've had a few years of training on a string instrument. You hack your way through them and sound okay. And that was part of the charm of them, right? I mean, again, he's writing for a patron who string instruments, not all that well, but played them. And I mean, another thing to keep in mind, actually, that string quartet is an interesting thing. The predominance of violins as a kind of elite instrument would flabbergast anybody from the 17th century. The fact that we go and listen indoors to violins playing really refined music would completely befuddle somebody from the 17th century, because these were instruments that were seen as outdoor instruments, right? And kind of uncouth. And violinists in the 16th century and into the 17th century, they're great violins, but these people, many of them couldn't read music at all. They played outdoor music, right? And some of the legacy of that goes into the 18th century. So Haydn writing a string quartet is writing music for entertainment in a bar, for entertainment on a street corner, right? I mean, it's tapping into a kind of rusticness that the violin had as a connotation, which it definitely no longer does, right? I mean, the upper class chamber music of the 17th century would have been for viols, right? And that's the thing that the courtly people played, and that's the music that tended to be notated, and the musicians who tended to be able to read it, right? And they were the ones who were playing real chamber music in the 17th century in the sense that we would think of it now. But for Haydn, yeah, the violin is this important thing, because again, it has this rustic feel to it. So that's those initial pieces, and which are designed for amateurs. But the funny thing, by the time, two other things. One, yes, there's a specifically musical compositional interest for him, right? In other words, these genres are places to explore for composers. And Haydn, chamber music's a really great place to experiment for a composer, because you can write something, you can hear 4 people play it really quickly. You don't have to pay a whole orchestra to try it out, right? You can get together with 3 of your friends, as Haydn did. There's this wonderful Christmas in the very early 1780s where Mozart had just got to Vienna, and Haydn plays second violin, and Mozart plays viola, and Ditters plays cello, and another composer plays first violin, and they go through each other's music. And like, it's the perfect place to do that, to experiment as a composer. So there's real musical interest in that genre. And I think that's part of why the string quartet becomes the kind of prestige genre for composers, right? So that even just not that long later, you get Haydn, when he's the most famous living composer, gets hired to go to London and is presenting string quartets on the concert stage next to his symphonies, and has to change his approach to writing because he's writing for halls that have 1,000 people in them. He can't write really quiet, subtle music, right? He's got to write big, bold, brash stuff that also shows off the first violinist. And so that gets more complicated. So it's these things feed on each other. Once a genre the composer gets interested in it, and good composers get interested and start to play off each other's music, that can change the course of what that, how do I say this? It can the composer's interest can change the relative importance of the genre in the ears of a public, right?
Right, and so I also want to, I'm curious in exploring by the time we get to Beethoven, I mean, I think the way that composers support themselves by that time, right? Once the patronage system collapses, then what do composers do to make their living? How do they make their living?
Right, and so Haydn already is clearly moving in that direction, right? I mean, he's making his living off of publication sales, about which he was extremely savvy, by the way. public concerts and these sorts of events, right? Beethoven's interesting, actually. He relied on patronage more than most of his, certainly more than Schubert. Schubert could never get access to the patrons that Beethoven had, because Beethoven came into the system before it all completely fell apart, and knew the right people. He was also savvy, despite being a very difficult person to get along with. He was pretty savvy at finding patrons who had the money to support experimental composition, right? So if you look at the dedicatees of a lot of his pieces, these are people who paid him a stipend and said, look, just sometimes dedicate a piece of music to me and I don't care. Like, it doesn't have to succeed commercially. You can write it, right? So he actually was a beneficiary of that system. But it is also the case that by the end of his career, very few people are in the sort of position that he commanded, right? And by the 1820s, there's a fascinating moment there with his late quartets, which are some of the most difficult, extremely fascinating experimental music ever written. They still sound that way, actually. I mean, it's pretty remarkable that they can sound so shockingly new. 200 years later, those pieces. We used to think that he wrote them purely for posterity, that he was thinking purely about people in 100 years will love this music. But no, in fact, he very carefully arranged performances of them, which were subscription concerts. And this was a very savvy thing to do, right? Where you would say, okay, you have to buy tickets in advance for 5 concerts as a group. You have to buy them together, right? In the way that you would buy season tickets to the Met or something. Now, you would buy a season ticket to the subscription concert of this concert series of a particular string quartet. This is the beginning of a sort of professional string quartet. And they're going to play, at each one of these concerts, they're going to play one of Beethoven's new pieces. And so that's a pretty savvy use of this.
So I'm curious about that transition, because this really turns into what our concerts look like now. Right. Because in those earlier concerts, sometimes you'd play a whole piece, but, it wouldn't be unusual to play a movement of a chamber work or a movement of a sonata. But the kind of subscription concerts you're talking about now, some of them would be repeated twice. It was always the complete piece. Those kinds of things that we associate with modern concerts, classical music concerts of today.
It's interesting. Beethoven and this particular quartet, the Schuppanzich quartet, had the kind of cachet to do this. It was extremely rare during Beethoven's lifetime. So we can think of it, it's a first, and therefore it's inevitable that that's the way music was going to unfold. It's really not inevitable at all. It was extremely unusual what they were doing. They were programming a lot of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. It's sort of the beginning of that idea of this kind of holy trinity of classical music. Comes out of those concerts during the end of Beethoven's life. That was rare and weird, because you're exactly right. It sounds a lot like classical music as we would now define it, right? Two of the 3 composers were already dead, and you're still playing their music, and you're pairing it with experimental new music. That sounds like a classical music concert. Not that many concerts were like that in the 1820s. In a way, Franz Liszt is really important here, not because, he's important because he did play a lot of chamber music in interesting ways, but he's even more important in the kind of pivotal role that he played in inventing this thing called the recital, because the chamber music concert, as it evolved over the course of the 19th century, really turns out to be more like a piano recital. That is, the same group of people on stage the whole time, playing music in similar genres, mixing older music by dead people, right, that has an importance to it, that is part of an emerging canon, with new experimental music, right? And Liszt did this all the time in his recitals, and that then becomes in some ways the model for the way a chamber music concert would work. The other important influence there, and then I'll shut up on this, is Clara Schumann. Clara Wieck Schumann. She's a sort of antipode to Liszt, right? Liszt, flashy, outgoing. He's the one who turns the piano around so you can watch his hands and marvel at his skill. And
see his profile.
And see his profile, his beautiful hair, But Clara Schumann is the one from whom we get "You Wear Black." If I was looking at those concerts, and the men were wearing white in the Brahms Requiem, but by and large, people are wearing dark clothing, unobtrusive clothing, right? Clothing that doesn't call attention to the performer per se, that allows the piece to speak through the performer. That's Clara. It has nothing to do with Franz Liszt. That's all Clara Wieck Schumann, right? And so her notion of the recital as a kind of act of reverence toward the composer, which is again anybody from the 17th or 18th century would look at you like you had two heads if you cared more about the composer than you cared about the performance, right? But that feature of that's crucial to the chamber music concert the way we tend to conceive of it now. You go to hear Beethoven. In a way, as much as you go and hear the Brentano, but you're hearing the Brentano play Beethoven, and that's a 19th century development also.
And isn't this coincident? You know, I'm talking about the audience who would go to these concerts. Isn't this coincident with the rise of the middle class? I mean, in some ways, that's what makes these concerts possible, right?
That's right. It's both the people who can afford to buy the sheet music and therefore support the composer, on the one hand, right? Not only afford to buy it, but presumably if you're buying scores, you're probably going to play them. Otherwise, why would you buy them? And so you need a critical mass of people, and that critical mass grew and grew over the 19th century, first often in German-speaking countries for a variety of reasons that aren't important now, and then transmitted across Western Europe, and also via a lot of immigrant migration also to the United States, right? So you need a critical mass of people who are interested in playing the music, and incompetent to read it, right? And all that. And then you also need another critical mass of people who might not be able to play the music, but who are invested in the cultural project of hearing it live, right?
Right. And I think we're running short on time now, but I also am curious about, because of this rising middle class, isn't part of the rise of this kind of chamber music concert actually deliberately exclusionary in a way? You know what I mean? Like meaning that the middle class wants to see themselves as, in a way, more cultured than other people, in the way that they can sit still, they can listen to, you know, an hour and a half or 2 hours of this kind of music. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, there's no question that you can trace its exclusiveness or exclusionariness to a variety of factors, right? One, its origins in a courtly context. Two, the leisure time that it takes to acquire the competence to be able to play this music. Three, the way that composers writing for players who have that leisure time construct music that's so complicated that to listen to it takes a kind of silent, careful, analytic style of listening, right? All of these things are exclusionary, and deliberately so, right? And then you connect it to the formation of a musical canon, right? In which people from a particular country, let's say the emerging German Empire, are interested in composers of their perceived cultural group, right? And the way that then, influences the formation of a canon around, if you think about who are the important composers of chamber music that you might learn about in, Music 101 20 or 30 years ago, it's almost an identical list to who are the important composers of music, period. That is notated classical music, right? Because chamber music is at the core of that exclusionary project. And I think the question of what the relevance of such an exclusionary project is today is a whole separate question, right? But I think there's no question that it was often explicitly and certainly implicitly construed in that way.
I mean, I asked the question because I think, if you talk to the average person now, and we spend a lot of time talking about this because the question always comes up, why is classical music, perceived as elitist, and then, we're always talking about how can we reach a broader audience and these kinds of questions. And, so that I'm interested in the origins of that. And it sounds like, well, part of the answer to that question is that it was conceived in a way that makes it like that. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, no, there's no question that it, right, for a variety of reasons. And I'm not saying one person sat down and intentionally created it to be this way, but I think, a whole variety of decisions and kind of market forces of a variety of kinds, and also collisions with sort of larger cultural forces, right? So, there's a reason why the Germans become interested in their own heritage as a people at the time when they don't have a country but want one, right? That is during the nation building projects of the 19th century. It's not just a German project, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of geographical regions and cultural zones that want to create a sense of their own culture, right? So it's not a coincidence that in the project of doing such a kind of nation building act, that a group of people might become interested in a group of composers who they see as embodying the best of previous generations of their culture, and that they might like to see those composers represented continuously on stage, even though they died 100 years ago, right? And so, like, there's a lot of factors that go into this, but I think your characterization of it as exclusive is completely correct. And if you think about the image of chamber music in popular consciousness, right? If you think, like, where in a movie do you see a string quartet? Well, the answer is in the background at a high-class wedding, or, right, you know, like
they're always wearing tuxedos, right?
Exactly, and they're wearing whatever right. I mean, that is it's a fact of the way that chamber music is perceived. That doesn't make it a good thing, but it is a fact.
Right. I mean, I think following up on that, I think, a lot of the kind of great chamber music comes out of that time, right? That's why most of the, Mozart, they're from Germany or Austria, right? And then you can look at the early 20th century where the French tried their own version of that project, right? with Debussy and Ravel. And so, I think it's clear, that there are forces beyond just musical forces that influence the development of music and chamber music in that way.
Certainly. Indeed. I can't go any farther than that. You're exactly correct.
But I think that, at least when I look at chamber music, and then the way I talk to you about chamber music, it in a way, and I don't think we think about this enough. It's a reflection of kind of the forces that are going on in society at that time. When you talk about, when Haydn puts gypsy music in his famous Gypsy Trio, or the Brahms G minor piano quartet, those things have come out of kind of political forces that and the question of, like, where do you belong, what's your identity, versus kind of other kinds of music where that's not your identity, that's explicitly not your identity.
Right. The question of nation and people and culture and identity, which was negotiated in so many crucial ways in Western Europe, in the years after the French Revolution, right, is not that it wasn't before, but that put a kind of pressing reason to think about these things, right? That's exactly reflected in so much of this music in a whole variety of ways, right? To say that in general you can make a generalization about the kind of exclusiveness of this art, it doesn't mean that everything is equally so, right? Composers had different attitudes toward it, right? And toward what could legitimately be made a part of it and what could not, right? So the attitude of a composer like Brahms or like Bartók is very, very different from the attitude of some other composers who work in these genres, right? And we haven't really talked, and probably don't have time today. I'm looking up at the computer, realizing what time it is. I mean, you could talk about the 20th century, which in so many ways, right, in musical styles and so many other ways, is such an explosion of variety,
of kind of, right? Influences from everywhere, right?
Right. And chamber music, it certainly is a part of that. But the funny tension is that its identity kind of inherited from the 19th century, right? Primarily from the 19th century, as a kind of exclusive, art form for a certain class of person and a certain highly adept player. It's something that we didn't talk about very much, but I think it is important that earlier definitions of chamber music, the people singing the madrigal or the motet or the mass at home in the 16th or 17th century, the viol consort, right? These sorts of people, they don't have to have the level of facility that you have to play that Dochnagny that you played, right? That or many of the other pieces that you put up there, right? These are hard pieces to get your fingers around as a player, or your voice around as a singer, and that's part and parcel of that exclusiveness, right?
Good. So I want to wrap up and then see if anyone has any questions. So if you have any questions, again, feel free to email us or type in the chat. I hope you can join us for next week, where we continue the conversation. And I think the question we want to tackle next time is, why is chamber music important? Why should we be listening to chamber music? Why did composers, and we touched on this briefly, why did composers, especially, the important composers that we like, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, come to chamber music to express their, and sometimes most important thoughts. You can think of the late Beethoven quartets. You can think of the Schubert cello quintet, one of his last pieces, the Brahms clarinet quintet. These are pieces written very, very late in these composers' career. What makes them come back to chamber music to express, in a way, their most profound thoughts? So I hope you can join us for that. Let's see, we have one question. One is, Paul, a question that says, when did public chamber music concerts come into being in European cities? When did that start?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. That's the kind of crucial question. I mean, I think you have to, in a way, discount the example that I gave of Haydn, right? When he goes to London in the 1790s, that's a kind of one-off. It's because he's so famous that there are these concerts which are devoted at least partially to, to kind of high caliber chamber music by high caliber players in a hall that seats 1,000 people and people are listening carefully. That's sort of more a function of Haydn than it is a function of public taste in a certain way that you could generalize beyond that. I think I'm not trying to hem and haw because how do I say this? I think it varies greatly from European zone to European zone. I think the general answer is over the course of the 19th century, right? But these things came later to France for a whole variety of reasons. They were, they had a lot of things to work out without worrying about public musical events. Let's put it that way. In the first couple of decades of the 19th century, right? And I'm not trying to be flippant about that, right? I mean, it depends on where you are, sort of how these things operate. And again, it depends also on how broad you're willing to be in your definition of chamber music, right? If you take, a number of the pieces that Melvin, that you put on this video, right? Like the Handel water music, right?
Right.
This was big public music in its day. Right? I mean, whatever a chamber was, it wasn't designed for a chamber, right? It was designed for outdoors, right? Hence the title, right? Yes. And to be performed on the water, right? And so that's, this interesting thing can happen where a piece of music can become, if your definition is broad enough, the piece of music can function as chamber music, despite not having been written for the same definition of chamber music that you mean now when you use that piece of music. I think so. Similarly, there's chamber music on public concerts in Europe from the beginning of the 19th century, particularly in German-speaking countries, particularly in the countries where composers are writing a lot of it, right? Again, it's interspersed with lots of other things. When Schubert got to do basically one concert of his own music during his life, it came in his last 14 months or something like that. And so he got to put together one Schubert concert, right? And naturally, because he can't afford to pay a symphony, right? Right? And he's only written one that he thought was worthwhile anyway, which is a great C major, and it was never played during his life. So, chamber music is cheap compared to symphony music, symphonic music, and so or opera, let alone. And so, the concert of music that Schubert gave of his own stuff was song and instrumental chamber music, right? I mean, that's the thing that makes sense to do. So you have these kind of one-offs that are specific to a given composer or place. But if what I think you're really asking, Philip, is the kind of the tradition of doing public chamber music concerts that we're all going to go listen to. One way you could trace this would be, what are the named quartets and when did they start showing up? When is there a string quartet that carries the name typically of its first violinist, but not necessarily, right? And that has longevity, that has staying power, right? The Helmsberger quartet, the Rosé quartet, right? These are later 19th century phenomena by and large. That's why the Schuppanzig quartet, the quartet that did those late Beethoven quartets, played them in quasi-public settings. I mean, subscription concerts, but still public settings. You could, if you paid the money, you could come. That's why that was so unusual at that time. That really is, that's an unusual thing. So I guess the answer is sporadically in the early 19th century and increasingly prominently over the course of the century.
Okay, great. I think we can wrap it up before everyone gets Zoom fatigue. I thank you for doing this, Paul.
Thank you, Melvin.
I look forward to doing it again next week. In 1 week at 7 p.m. again, please join us. And I look forward to talking about why chamber music is important to a bunch of composers. And then after that, please remember to join us on July 4th for a streaming concert of the Brentano Quartet, which includes a late Beethoven quartet, Opus 132, great piece. So thank you all again for joining us, and see you next time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.